Yes, all good.
Okay. Okay, so I'm happy to give you this little taster of what you might experience in the EMBA. And so, as Isabel just said, so I'm a professor of economics and business at Oxford University, and I'm teaching a course called Firms and Markets in the EMBA. And so, in fact, so when I have to do this little teaser, so then I decided to give you a flavor of what happens in the actual EMBA program. I'm gonna teach you something that is similar to what I'm going to expose the students to in 2 weeks when they come to Oxford. So firms and markets is basically an economics course. So it uses tools from economics to study firm decisions and market dynamics. And it's important to bear in mind that economics is just one prism through which you can look at businesses and markets, and you'll meet other like competing prisms in your Oxford EMBA. So it's not that economics is true, but it's one perspective on the world of business and markets. Now, what I'm going to do today, well, so we're going to talk about how broad economic conditions ripple through markets and affect the firms that are serving them. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to start by putting together some very basic ingredients from economics to develop a framework that allows us to study this kind of questions. And then we're going to apply that framework to a very particular economic shock, namely the sharp increase in US import tariffs in 2025. So the goal is now really to say, well, what can we take from economics, from theory, and from empirical analysis, and to shed light on a very concrete question, which is like, so how should foreign exporters to the US expect to be affected by these very large tariffs that were put in place in spring and summer 2025? Now, just to convince you that the Trump tariffs enacted in spring and summer were indeed like a pretty stark shock to the world economy. So this is a figure that shows you that the average US tariff rate on imports of goods. And it shows you like a long time series back to the 1920s. And as you can see, so tariffs in the US have decreased over time. And since the 1980s, they've basically been very low, below 5% on average. And then you see just one data point up here, which is October 25, and you can see that like the tariffs have indeed gone through the roof and are now like basically back to the levels that they were before the Second World War. So just to be very concrete, so let's just say, so what is the case that we have in mind here that we want to understand better? And so just for concreteness, you have to consider like a Vietnamese manufacturer of budget bicycles. It is selling domestically and to retailers in the US and also selling in foreign markets. And now the US introduces a 20% tariff on bicycles imported from Vietnam. And the question that the CEO of this Vietnamese firm is asking herself is like, how will my firm be affected by these tariffs in the short run and in the longer run? So you can think of different adjustment margins. So like a priori, kind of many things are possible here. And so to see that, it suffices just to write down like a very, very simple equation here that says, well, what is going to be the final price that consumers are meeting in the US of these budget bicycles? Well, that's going to be the price that the producer is charging when the firm is selling into the US market is going to be a markup charged by the retailer. And then on top of that is going to come the import tariff. And clearly, so if the producer does not change behavior, but is selling at the same price as always, and the retailer does not change behavior, but is selling at the same with the same markup as always, well, then the entire import tariff is going to be passed through this chain to the consumers. And so in that case, well, then producers will get the same prices they're used to, but they'll be selling less because consumers are now like buying less bicycles, given that they'll be more expensive. But of course, it could also happen that retailers will see this coming and will be willing to absorb part of the shock by reducing their markups. There will be like this term going down, in which case like less of the tariff will be passed on to consumers, and the quantity sold will decrease by less. And finally, it's also possible that the producer being so unhappy with the quantity sold fallen that it will actually be willing to take a decrease in the price at which it is selling to the retailers, thus seeing like a change in the producer price. And so in this case, like the producer is directly affected, right? Because it is just receiving less money for each bicycle it is selling into the US. Now, so that's just a problem, and I guess what we are trying to understand here is like to what extent, like the last thing here happens, to what extent producers are affected, like through a drop in the price at which it is selling into the US when these tariffs comes into place. And so the first step we'll take toward answering this question is to develop a little framework of competitive markets. And so we basically just need a couple of very simple ingredients. And so we will describe very simply so the demand side of the economy, so the buyers of bicycles or whatever is being sold in this market with a simple demand curve. And what does the demand curve tell us? Well, it tells us basically at each price that you can imagine, it tells you like how much is going to be demanded is going to be bought by buyers in this market. All right. And we'll think of this as being like a downward sloping curve. So why? Well, because as the price is falling, there'll be, one, more buyers stepping into the market to buy this good. And second, each buyer might actually buy more of the good. So that is why we expect like the demand curve to be downward slope. So this is a curve that is kind of describing the buyer side of the market that we have in mind. And the second ingredient that we'll need is something that describes like the sellers in this market. And we'll then use the supply curve to describe that. So what is a supply curve? Well, that's a curve that gives us at each price level that you can imagine, it tells us like how much will all the sellers in this market be willing to sell. And we'll think of this as something that is sloping upwards. Why? Because as the price is going up, there'll be more sellers that are willing to sell this item when they can get more for it in the market. And also each seller that is in the market might want to supply more. So these are two reasons why the supply curve is going up. And now let's combine these two, and that gives us like a very simple framework here for thinking about kind of what is the equilibrium in a market, like where does the market end up? Well, if we overlay these two curves, we'll see that there's one intersection, meaning there's one price at which the quantity that consumers want to buy equals the quantity that producers want to sell. And this combination of a price and a quantity, we'll call that like the equilibrium in the market. Okay, so this might all be very basic to those of you who've studied any economics before, but these are kind of the essential building blocks for starting thinking about what happens when we shock this market with something like a tariff or something else. So the goal is here to apply this framework in order to understand how this US import tariff, how it might affect this Vietnamese producer of bicycles. And so just to proceed to that application, we need to make a couple of simplifications. So that's something that economics very often does, like in order to be able to develop simple frameworks for analyzing questions, we need to simplify the world. And so here we'll make the following like simplifications, and we can come back to that later on and say, well, did we make a big mistake by doing any of this? We might have done but let's just go on with that for a second. So we'll for a moment here, we'll now ignore that there are any final consumers. We'll just think of like the demand side of this market for Vietnamese bicycles are now the US retailers that are buying from the Vietnamese producers. We'd also assume that like all of these budget bikes that are being sold by foreign producers in Vietnam and other places, that they're all exactly the same. So there'll be no different makes that that consumers prefer like one over the other. We'll also assume, and this is not exactly true in the real world, that there are no country differences in the tariff rate that the US applies. So we'll just think of like a uniform tariff rate being put on all non-US producers of budget bikes. And to make things even simpler, we'll say, well, there's no kind of real US domestic production here of bicycles. So everything that is being sold in this market is coming from foreign producers. Now, with those assumptions, we can come back to the same figure and say, well, this is now our market for, or this is the market for budget bicycles in the US. We have a supply curve that is like all these foreign producers of budget bikes that are selling like budget bikes into the US. And then there's a demand curve that is given by US retail companies that, of course, they plan to sell these bikes onto their US customers, but so they will have this demand curve here. All right, so that's the basic setup. The question is now, so what happens in this market when we introduce a tariff? And to see this, let's do like just a very simple kind of numerical example. Let's just say, well, before the tariffs were introduced, there was a wholesale market price of budget bikes at $100. So retailers were buying from Vietnam and other places bikes at $100. And let's say that this particular Vietnamese producer that we are looking at, that he was choosing to supply 10,000 bikes to the US every year at this price of $100. Now, let's assume that the US imposed a $20 tariff on these imported bikes at the border. And then we can answer what happens? Well, and it's a big if, but if the wholesale price were to go up to $120, so that like the entire tariff was just being added to the price that this Vietnamese producer receives, well then, from the perspective of this producer, it would like that increase in the price would exactly offset the tariff. So after the tariff, they would get exactly $100 for each bike as before. So they would choose to supply the same 10,000 bikes as they did before, just because they get the same price after tariffs as they did before the tariff. And so that reasoning allows us to actually kind of redraw this market after the tariff has been put in place. And the key thing to see here is that the tariff will just do one thing in the diagram. It's going to shift the supply curve up exactly by the amount of the tariff. All right. So if we had the old supply curve, that's the gray line. Now, when we have a tariff of $20, well, that's going to shift the supply curve up to the new supply curve by exactly that amount. And again, the logic is that, so if I was willing to sell exactly 10,000 bikes at a price of $100, well, now that I have to pay I have to pay a tariff of 20 per bike, well, then I'm willing to sell the same 10,000 bikes if I get a price of $120, because that is the same as a price of $100 after the tariff. All right. Now, so all that happens in our diagram is that the supply curve is shifting up from the old one, this is the gray line, to the blue line, and the amount of the shift is $20. And so that allows us to then directly see, okay, what happens now to the equilibrium in this market? And again, we'll have like the old equilibrium is described by these gray letters, so the old equilibrium price and the old equilibrium quantity. And now we are going to a new equilibrium with the black letters, where the price has gone up and the quantity has become smaller. All right. So we can see that now the price that consumers are paying, or sorry, the price that these retailers are paying is higher than it was before. But it's also easy to see that the price that the retailers are paying does not go up by the full $20. So like the the increase from the gray to the black P, from the old P to the new price, is not as large as like this shift up in the demand curve, in the supply curve. So what are we learning? We are learning, so basically this is just another way to redraw the same graph. So we are just saying, well, basically we are now at like to the price that the retailers will pay, including the tariff, will be here. That's going to be higher than the price they used to pay. But at the same time, given that this is the price that the producers are charging, and they have to pay the tariff of $20 after receiving whatever they get from the retailers, well, then the retailers or the producers are also receiving less than they used to, right? So the price they receive is lower than the price that they used to get. So what does this mean in economic terms? It means that, I mean, the first thing to see here is that tariffs, while in this case they're being put directly on the foreign producers, in fact, in the new equilibrium, they will not just affect that side of the market. They will ripple through the market and potentially also affect the other side of the market, so the buyers. And in fact, as we will see in a minute, it could be that the buyers will be exposed to most of the burden of these tariffs. So what happens in terms of economics? Well, again, we started out with a pre-tariff market price of $100 per bicycle. And what happens then when we introduce the tariffs is that producers now have to pay like $20 in tariffs per bike that they are selling. So they are willing to sell less bicycles than they were before. And so initially, before the market then adjusts, we'll then be in a situation where demand is larger than supply, right? Because at the price of $100, well, then retailers will still want to buy whatever amount they bought before, but suppliers are willing to sell less because now they have to pay a tariff whenever they sell a bicycle. And so when we have demand being larger than supply, well, then the market is out of equilibrium and there'll be an upward pressure on the price, right? There'll be kind of retailers are screaming to get hold on these bicycles that are being sold to the US, and that's going to drive up the price. And what we can say is that then in the new equilibrium that will emerge, the price will be somewhere between $100 and $120. So it could be that the price barely changes and stays close to $100. It could also be that the price changes by the full amount of the tariff. All right. So just at this initial stage of the analysis here, we can just say, well, it's important to understand that the tariff burden might be shifted to some extent from the producers to the retailers, but we cannot, without making any more assumptions, we cannot say exactly like how much of the burden will be shifted to the retailers. All right. So I think this is a really good place actually to take questions if someone has. So I know that this is going to be a less of an interactive experience than you will have like in the proper EMBA course, but still I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any, like about just clarifying what is going on here maybe. I'm having a look at this chat and there are no questions. So Isabel, is it possible to just unmute oneself and ask questions, or does it have to be in the chat?
Feel free to raise your hand if you have any
Ah,
questions. I can try to unmute you for the questions as well. Otherwise, we can leave any questions at the end, and then we can
okay.
double check whether we have more questions coming up to the Q&A.
Okay. I was just thinking for kind of clarifying questions, it would be good to have them now. There's one. Put him up.
There you go.
Hi, yes, it's Purnima. Just a question. So I see that at the bottom you said that the tariff burden can be shared between the producers and the buyers. But, and I guess, there's a spectrum of one extreme and the other. But So have we also seen that the buyers end up taking the majority of the brunt and the producers, I mean, it's really not on them that the tariffs are being put on them. So they end up, charging as much as they can, or paying as much as they can. But then for the price, they end up, like you said, they take the $100, they add whatever tariffs. And so essentially, most of the, majority of that brunt is being experienced by the
So
inflation in the economy, right? So
So
is it
that's what we're getting to. So kind of, so we are you're
okay? Okay.
absolutely right. So we are at a point, we're at an early stage in the analysis saying, well, there's a $20 tariff. Potentially, it could be kind of being absorbed by the producers. It could also be absorbed by retailers or consumers. And we're trying to understand using both theory and in a moment also like some data analysis. So what actually happens? Is it one or the other? Like, is it,
Okay.
as you are saying, is it being passed on and just becomes consumer inflation, or is it the foreign producers who have to take a bump to their profits?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So let's move on. So that was a great question because that really kind of pointed to where we are going. We want to understand more than just, yes, the tariff burden can be shared. We want to understand like, so how is it shared? And so the first thing we'll do is just to stare a bit harder at our graphs here. So basically, kind of within this framework of competitive markets, we can actually understand, like we can get some insights about where that tariff burden is going to land. And so, as we said, so generally it is true that the burden is somehow shared between the two sides of the market. That's already important that it's not just because you are putting a tariff on foreign producers, they will end up kind of taking the bump. And so the next thing here is, well, how the burden is shared between the two sides of the market here depends on the relative steepness of the demand and the supply curve. So now that's a lot to take in just in one mouthful here, but just so we'll kind of develop it more. But the insight here is that foreign producers will suffer more. They'll have a bigger share of the burden the steeper the supply curve is relative to the demand curve. Okay, and vice versa, like the produced foreign producers will suffer less if the supply curve is flat relative to the demand curve. So let's try to, so that's kind of the result or like the finding. Let's just unpack this in two ways. So first, so let's just look just to convince ourselves that this is true. Let's have a look at these graphs. So now, like I've drawn the demand and supply curves in slightly different ways than before, in exactly to emphasize this point about like the importance of the relative steepness of the supply and demand curves. So in the first example, on the left side, you will see like a very flat demand curve and a very steep supply curve. So that like the supply here is like by far the steepest of the two. And if you look at then what happens once you shift the supply curve up, you see that well almost nothing happens to the price paid by the retailers, by the buyers, right? So basically, as you can see in this example, kind of the new price line here is just almost exactly on top of the old price, meaning that almost none of the tariff here is being passed on to the buyers. The sellers are eating everything, all the shot. All right. So that was one extreme example where the supply curve is relatively steep. And you can see in the other example, on the right side, the opposite. So here I've just drawn these curves in the opposite way so that the demand curve is the relatively steeper curve. And here you can see the other result that basically starting from the gray line, like the old price, you can see that now almost the entire tariff burden here is being shifted in to the price paid by the retailers. So basically the producers don't suffer at all, like all is borne now by the buyers. All right. So that was just kind of the mechanics of it, just to convince ourselves, yes, there's something about the relative steepness of these curves that matter. It's the relatively more steep curve that bears more of the burden. And so what does that mean in terms of economics? Well, so what does it mean when the supply curve is flat? So that was like the right side. Well, it means basically that we have a very price sensitive supply. Okay, so let's have a look again. So that was like the right side where we have like a very flat supply curve. That means that the quantity, like the amount that the producers are willing to sell, depends a lot on the price. If the price is changing a little bit, like the supply of these producers changes a lot. And when will that be the case? Well, that will be the case when it's easy, just because of technology, to scale production up and down. It'll be the case when it is easy for a Vietnamese producer to shift their sales to other markets. So say that if they can get $100 per bicycle in the US, they can just sell in Canada or Brazil or France or whatever. And it'll be the case also when there's a small profit margin for producers. So if you have like a very competitive market for producers, well, then they're just not able to kind of to absorb a lot of the tariff before without going bust, just because they're already making so little money. Okay, so these would be cases where we have like yes, so a very flat supply curve that suggests, that actually we'll end up in a situation where the U.S. buyers will be taking more of this tariff burden. And so on the other side, so again, so when is it true that the demand curve is steep? That's the same side of the diagram. So this is kind of over here where we have like a relatively steep demand curve. So what does that mean in terms of economics? Well, it means, well, first of all, that demand is price insensitive, right? That's kind of the mechanical thing so this a steep curve, this means that, even if the price changes quite a lot up and down, the quantity being demanded by consumers, or in this case retailers, does not change very much. They will buy almost the same amount of bicycles no matter what the price is. And when can that be the case? Well, that can be the case when it is hard to substitute to other products. When there is, I mean, when you need the bikes you need, so it's really hard to find substitutes. So, even if the price goes up by some amount, you're going to still buy your bikes. It could also be true when products are differentiated. So like when consumers actually have like a preference for certain makes over other makes, so then they'll be willing to pay a higher price, although like yeah, it's more expensive. And it could also be the case finally when you have large profit margins for retailers. If they really make a lot of money on these bicycles, well, then even if they have to bear a big share of the tariff burden, well, then they will still be in the market and buy the same amount of bikes that they did before. Okay, so this is all kind of theory. So within this very, very simple, very kind of basic framework for thinking about competitive markets, what should we expect? We learn something about like who bears the burden of a tariff. We learn that it's not necessarily the side of the market on which we put the burden, that the burden can be shifted around. And also this gives us some heuristics for understanding. So is it more likely that the burden is going to land on demand or supply? And then you can start thinking about, so depending on what market you're in, kind of the market, does it look more like the left-hand side or the right-hand side? Do we have any questions about this? So this is also a good time. This is kind of as far as we get with the theory alone, and then we're going in a minute going to move into to some statistical analysis or some data analysis. But this is a good place to take like a question or two if someone wants to ask something.
Hi, Professor. We do actually have a few questions in the Q&A. Do you want to pick up some of these?
In the chat?
Yes. Are you able to see that? Otherwise, I'm happy
No,
to read.
I cannot
Okay.
see it.
Okay. So one question from Anand. So he's asking about passing on the cost to tariff to customers. Are you okay to elaborate a bit more on that?
I didn't hear the question. Sorry.
Yeah, one question about passing on the cost of tariff to customers. Could you
Mhm.
elaborate on that?
By the retailers to the customers. That's maybe the question.
Yeah, Annan, are you still there?
Yes, I
Otherwise,
think that was the question. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of, I mean, so I think to really say something about that, you would need to then model kind of the retail market, right? Where the sellers are now like these retailers and the consumers are the buyers. And so basically you will have the same forces determining like if you think that market can also be construed as a perfectly competitive market, you could use the exact same framework to think about that market and think about whether a supply curve is likely to be flat or demand curve likely to be steep or whatever. It could also be that you think, well, actually, this retail market is not likely to be a perfectly competitive market, and then you would need another kind of model to or another framework to think about it.
great, thank you. Can we ask one more question
Yes,
from
sure.
Kanya? They ask, under what conditions can tariffs actually benefit domestic industries?
Under what conditions? So I guess like so that's not really the question we are after here. That's a good question. It's not the question we are after here, because here we're really asking, okay, what happens to the foreign producer, right? And we have kind of like also assumed the way in a sense that there will like in this framework that there will be an effect on like on the domestic industry because we said, well, there is no kind of US production of budget bikes, and they're just so I think we'll be saying here that I mean in that particular market, it is not likely that there will ever be any significant US production of bikes. There will always, I mean, at least in the foreseeable future, salaries will be so high in the US that they will never be able to compete in this market for budget bikes, even if sitting behind a tariff wall. So then there's a much bigger question, of course, like so in other industries where it is true that, like if you're thinking about markets where there is a local US production, well then these US producers will be benefited will benefit from the less fierce competition from abroad. And so that's one mechanism. And you can also imagine that these foreign producers of whatever thing you have in mind will then set up production in the US. And I guess that's kind of the kind of mechanism that the US administration has in mind. I think it's very important though to say, well, it is true that by distorting like the price signal here by saying, well, we are essentially favoring local producers over foreign producers, you are likely to, like in some cases, maybe not budget bikes, but for other goods, to get a bigger like domestic production of that good. But in an economy where like you would think in the long run, like all resources are being used productively, that everybody, that is able to work will eventually have a job. Capital is also being used one way or the other. Then if you are effectively bringing in new industry by distorting the price signal, you'll be crowding out production of other things, right? So if you put like a 10,000% tariff on bicycles, you would get production of bicycles in the US. But like the people who are producing these bicycles and the capital for producing those bicycles are then not producing what they could have been producing absent the tariff, and they would have been more productive in these alternative uses. So even if you can kind of bring like industry or domestic activity like in by protecting your domestic firms with a tariff, it doesn't mean that it's beneficial because you'll basically be crowding out other and more profitable activity in the process. That was a very long answer. I hope that it made some sense. I think we need to move on. So the last thing I wanted to share with you is also some lessons um, from statistical analysis of or econometric analysis we call it in economics of past experiences with tariffs. All right, so we can say, well, so actually it turns out that this is not the first time that the US imposes tariffs on foreign producers. In fact, there was like a significant wave of tariffs during the first Trump administration that was mostly targeted at China. And so by studying like what happened to prices, to producer prices, import prices, so on, around those events, we can learn something, or we can extrapolate that experience to what we are seeing today. All right. And so concretely, what I mean, this is not the whole story, but part of what happened, like during the first Trump administration, was that the US imposed like a series of tariffs on imports from China. So there's a first wave in July 2018, so a 20% tariffs on goods imports of a total value of $34 billion. Then 1 month later, like 25% on another set of goods amounting to $16 billion of imports. Then 1 month later, like a slightly lower rate of 10%, but targeting like a much bigger chunk of imports of $200 billion. And that rate was then increased to 25% in May 2019. And then again in September 2019, another set of goods being brought in, 112 billion, and subjected to a tariff rate of 10%. So like these five, you could say, like policy changes where kind of the tariffs on more and more goods are gradually being bumped up more and more. And so the question is like, so how did that affect like the prices paid by US retailers in 2018, 2019? And I'll just show you one picture that illustrates this pretty well. So it shows you a lot of price indices. It's a little bit of a confusing graph here. But what's important to realize here is that, when the US introduces import tariffs on certain goods from a specific goods and one specific country, okay? Then there are some goods that will be affected by the tariff and some goods that will not. They'll be unaffected. All right. And so here you see, price indices that are kind of the prices paid by the US retailers, if you want. So the import prices, including tariffs, for seven different categories of goods. So 4 of them are the ones that we just talked about, that were being treated by these tariffs. These are the red dotted ones here. And then there are also the full blue line is imports that are from different countries than China and in categories that are not affected by these tariffs. It's also the dotted blue line that is imports from other countries than from China. It is the good categories that are being targeted like for China, but because it's from a different country than China, they are also being unaffected by these tariffs. And then finally, the full red line is the goods that are being imported from China, but they belong to categories that are not subject to tariffs at any time during this period. So these are the three. You could think of those as kind of as if you think a bit about like the doctors that you give you want to test like the efficacy of a new drug, and you give like the pill with the drug to a treatment group, and you give like a pill without the drug to a control group. You can think of these three groups of goods as your control group of goods. Okay, so these are goods that are not being directly affected by the tariffs. And as you can see, kind of the price indices here, well, they're kind of falling gradually throughout the period 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20. And nothing specific, I mean, nothing particularly interesting happens around the time when these tariffs are rolled out, consistent with the fact that these goods are just not, being exposed to tariffs. And now if you compare to the 4 groups of goods that are being subjected to tariffs, you can see a very stark difference, that exactly at the time when the tariffs are being introduced, this is a different time for each of the 4 groups here, but exactly at this time, you can see that the import price jumps up, right? So in the first case, you have the first tariff is being introduced in, was it July 2018? You see exactly in that month, you see the price index, it goes from around 1 and up to 1.2. more than 1.2, so like a more than a 25% increase in tariffs. Oh, sorry, in the price paid by producers, by retailers, sorry. And the same is true for all of these four different group categories. They go up by different extents, but as we'll see in a minute, that is also because like the tariff that was being introduced varies a little bit. So this is really strong evidence that so who paid for like the first wave of Trump tariffs in 2019? Well, at least the retail margin, at least in this first market where foreign producers and retailers are interacting, you see that almost the entire price of the tariffs is being passed through to the retailers. All right. And they can put some numbers on that. So in this paper, they're saying, well, actually, so if we do some more statistical analysis, you will see that almost the entire tariff burden falls on importers. So every time you have a $1 of tariff, you'll see a 6 cent decrease in producer prices. So the foreign producers bear 6% of the tariff burden, whereas 94% is being passed on, passes through to the import price. And then, as per the question from before, so then there's a separate question about like how much is then being eaten by the retailers and how much is being passed on to consumers. So these results also show that actually, so there's a kind of a striking difference between different types of products. So those Chinese imports that were being subjected to tariffs, so they vary in different dimensions. And one way to slice that set is into two parts. So one is being differentiated goods, and one is being undifferentiated goods, like homogeneous goods, where the brand doesn't matter at all. And you can see that like for the differentiated goods, where consumers care more maybe about the brand name, there's almost no incidence on the producers. Almost the entire tariff is being passed on to the import price. Whereas for the undifferentiated goods, things look a little bit differently. So then it's like between 1/4 and 1/3 actually seems to of the burden actually seems to be borne by the producer. All right. So then we can think again about our Vietnamese producer of budget bikes. Well, where do I think I belong? Do I belong? Is my good to be considered more differentiated or more undifferentiated? That should guide my expectation as to how I'll be affected by this US tariff. So the very final thing I want to show you is like how this matters for policy. All right, because so initially, so that the US tariffs announced in April were not random, or so they varied a lot by country, and actually they were calibrated, or there's an attempt to calibrate them in order to like where the objective was to really eliminate the trade deficit for each counterpart foreign country. Okay, so there was to say, well, if we have a 10% trade deficit with the European Union, we want to set a tariff that exactly eliminates, so reduces imports by 10%, so we get rid of the deficit. And the same for other countries. So kind of by foreign country, you want to calibrate the tariffs so as to balance the trade. Okay. And then if you look hard enough, you can see kind of on the website of the US Trade Representative, a bit of a technical note that explains like, so the logic behind this, how to do this. And they're saying, well, we can predict how a tariff on goods from a particular country will change the imports according to this formula here. Because we're saying if we impose a tariff of some size, or we increase the tariff vis-a-vis, let's say, Vietnam by some amount, well, then we know something from previous studies about how that feeds into import prices. All right. And so that is captured by this parameter here. And we know, they say from literature, that this is around 0.25. So every time we move the tariff by 1 percentage points, we're going to increase import prices by 0.25 percentage points. All right. And then we also know something about whenever import prices goes up, how much will import demand go down? And here this is captured by this parameter epsilon. And what we learned from reading papers is that this parameter should be around -4, saying that whenever the import price goes up, it goes up by 1 percentage point, we will see imports going down by 4 percentage points. All right. And so with this framework here, it says basically, well, if this is true, well, then basically, if you do the math, it just means that if I have a 20% import or a trade deficit, I need like a 20% tariff to balance trade. Okay. And so this is the formula that we're guiding kind of this chart that Donald Trump was showing on Independence Day in the US, saying like, why do we have different tariff rates vis-a-vis for different countries? Well, that is because the formula here tells us that these are the rates we need to balance trade. So what is a bit crazy is though that like this number here, because you might now think, well, actually we just learned something else. We just learned that this phi here, this number is not 0.25. It is not the case that when I increase tariffs by 1, I'll have like a 25-cent increase in import prices. No, what we learned was that phi should be in fact 95. Right? We just said that most of the tariff will be passed through to import prices. And so the framework kind of, you can argue whether it makes sense or whether it doesn't make sense, but what is really strange is this number here. And it's consequential because basically if you use like the 95 number that we just learned from that study, you would have gotten tariff rates that were approximately 4 times smaller. Then you wouldn't need a 20% tariff to equilibrate a 20% trade deficit, but only a 5% tariff rate. And in fact, so what is then even more strange is that, that note here, the technical memorandum here actually says, well, where do we have the 0.25, estimate from? Well, we have it from a paper by a guy called Brent Nyman, who is now a professor at Chicago. And he then wrote a couple of days after, he wrote an essay in the New York Times saying, well, guys, you are citing my paper, but you are like misusing it because like the number you should have used is not 25%, but 95%. And by implication, kind of the tariff rate you should have imposed should have been 4 times smaller than the ones that you chose. So all this just to say, well, actually, this really matters very directly for kind of formulation of trade policies. That's all I wanted to say. I think I've gone over time, so I'm sorry about that. That happens when you get really excited about something. But let's do a little bit of Q&A, and then after that, I will pass the word back to Isabel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor. So we do have a few more questions from the audience. Let me just see. We have one question from Brian. What is the logic behind instituting tariffs when the result seems to be economic chaos?
Okay, I think that's a good question, but that goes a little bit beyond maybe the framework that we are using here. But I mean, so maybe what you have in mind is not just imposing tariffs, because I think that so tariffs are not necessarily a recipe for chaos, but when you use like tariffs not to just achieve certain economic or industrial policy goals, but also as a leverage in kind of other conflicts between countries, meaning that the tariff that you are announcing are changing all the time, which creates a lot of uncertainty on the side of business. And I think so that's something that we cannot really speak to like within this framework, but it is definitely like a very important consideration too.
Great, thank you. Osid, I see you raised your hand a while ago. Okay, I'm happy to touch base on one more. Yeah. Okay. Um, so you've talked about demand. How did consumer spending power change historically when high tariffs were in place before?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
How did consumer spending power change historically when high tariffs were in place before?
Um, Good question. So maybe I guess what is behind this question is this idea that that tariffs. So to the extent that that's the question we've been talking about. To the extent that tariffs are passed on to consumers, it's gonna create inflation and thus drive down kind of the purchasing power of consumers. So they'll have the same potentially like nominal incomes, but then everything is more expensive, so you can buy less stuff. And so that I think that really speaks to, like tariffs and being ultimately a tax on consumers, or at least to the extent that they are passed on to consumers, it's really a consumption tax. And then clearly they are eroding like the purchasing power of consumers, but also kind of shifting income like into the to treasury, which is like, so the US has a big fiscal deficit, so like money is needed there too. So like that is not necessarily bad to increase taxes. Like the problem is really that you do it in this distorted way, where you're creating distortions between foreign and domestic producers and between kinds of goods that are being taxed at different rates.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Professor, for such clear and insightful exploration of the economics behind the Trump tariffs. And thank you for everyone here for your questions and active engagement. We hope you find today's session interactive. And before we wrap up, I'd like to give this opportunity to briefly talk about the application process of the Executive MBA program. So when it comes to the application requirements, you will need to provide your academic transcripts, recent CV, two professional references, GRE, GMAT, or executive assessment result. If you don't speak English as a native language, we will require English language test result like TOEFL or IELTS. There will be three essay questions covered in your application and followed by a video essay, kind of like elaborate a bit more on your third essay questions. So feel free to scan on the QR code, find more information on the website. We still consider late applications for the January 2026 intakes if you have a strong profile. And in the meantime, we do have 4 stages when it comes to September 2026 applications, which will be January, March, May, and June. So, if you'd like to learn more about the Executive MBA program or continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to our team, submit your CV for a review, book a consultation with our dedicated team, or join us at an upcoming event like this. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you for future Oxford masterclasses. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Professor. We'll see you next time.